Talking about Ireland West Airport, Knock Airport, in the next decade. This is going to be a bit of a religious experience or a bit of an apparition, because it's probably appropriate in the capital of Botox that we have a look at what's been happening since I came here more than 10 years ago to talk about what the last decade would bring. These are some of the eminent travel trade members on the night. Got some of it right, some of it probably needs a little bit of re-examination, but it has been a good decade. And all of these people were looking at a great deal of uncertainty when we gathered here in 2009, because the travel industry and the country in general was facing a major recession. We didn't know how deep it would go, but we did know that we'd all have to work harder. And that really has been the nature of Knock since these guys gathered to build the runway. We were going to build an airport that was supposedly going to bring pilgrims from all over the world, but there were very few inbound flights bringing pilgrims into Knock. Most of what has happened has been more in common with the economic model of a regional airport across the rest of Europe than this inbound pilgrims airport, which everybody expected who watched the RTE report.
Many believed it would never happen, but early this morning the first flights for Knock were on Dublin Airport's departure screens, and a check-in desk was opened for passengers, mainly press and television crews, who would be on board the first jet aircraft to land in Knock. As thousands of spectators began to arrive at Connacht Regional Airport for what has been described as one of the greatest days in the history of the west of Ireland, the flight crew were making their final preparations. The weather in Knock was hazy, but visibility seemed to be improving all the time. In Dublin, Captain Bagnall would make his decision based on the latest weather report.
And pressure 1030 decibel.
Okay, John, that's fine. We'll have an on-time departure.
An on-time departure.
The takeoff was on time, and as the St. Union flew west, the pilots made their first contact with Knock Airport. Visibility was still poor, but not bad enough to stop the landing. And just 25 minutes after leaving Dublin, the aircraft was lining up for its final approach. On the ground, the excitement increased as the aircraft was first heard and then seen flying in through the mist. This was the day the people of the West had been waiting for years. No longer would Knock be a practice ground for drivers, and Monsignor Horan was the man of the day.
They have the makings of a very fine, small airport here. Many airports we operate to don't have facilities that they appear to be providing here.
I came because I have very many friends in Mayo, and also last year I was involved in the choosing of the Mayo Man of the Year, and you know who that was, Monsignor himself.
I'm delighted to have been on the first flight to arrive in Knock.
Did you ever think, when you were growing up in Mayo, that you would one day fly into an airport in Knock?
Never. Never for one moment. It's great.
Well, as one of the signs here says, Monsignor Horan has got his wings at last. Behind me, the first passengers are being led out from Knock Airport on board the Boeing 737, the first aircraft to land in Connacht Regional Airport. The weather's improving, and hopefully, within about a half an hour or so, the first 707 will land again to take charter passengers out to Rome. 110 people travelled on the first 737 flight from Knock to Rome. As they made their way to the aircraft, the crowds outside the airport waved them off and wished them luck. None of them would swap their tickets for this plane for anything.
I'm going just to be on the first flight, and I'm curate in the parish here in Charlestown, so I think it's important that we have a representative.
I think there's an example set here for the whole of Ireland, that the people of Ireland must, and particularly the people of the west of Ireland, must really get things done for themselves. We mustn't be depending on the people in Dublin to show us what we can do. We must do things for ourselves.
It was just after 11 o'clock when the 737 taxied back onto the runway. As it lined up for takeoff, Monsignor Horan watched.
Well, all the saints, all the Irish saints in heaven will be praying for us now, and all the Irish saints and all the Irish saints will help us to bring it the full circle, and that we will really get a lot of support.
When you look across there at the hundreds on the hills and on the opposite side of the runway, out to the perimeter.
It reminds me of the papal visit. That's right. It reminds me of the papal visit when the hills at Knock were covered with people. I see crowds and crowds of people over there on the hills, and I'm glad that I have an opportunity of viewing this aircraft taking off.
There were individual charters that brought pilgrims in from North America. The big transatlantic experiment was Fly Globespan in 2007. But the idea would be bringing people directly into Mayo, directly out of Mayo. Low frequency. Was it going to work? It didn't. Transatlantic service really doesn't make sense point to point yet. It's too subject to the winds of change. And the concept of low cost, which has taken a bit of a battering in recent times because of the failure of Norwegian services, is still there. It's not going away. In fact, technology makes it even more possible. We've had great visitors, Joe Biden, Michael Bloomberg, you'll have seen flashing by. What would the O'Dwyer political machine make of two Knock candidates for the Democratic nomination? We've other services, we've seen them come, we've seen them go. A lot of dependency on Ryanair, a lot of dependency on Aer Lingus. They tend to burn off competition, and of course some of the airlines that we had here are no longer around. But overall, Ireland Airport West has done well, and some of the figures that I was throwing out when I talked in 2009 have not only been impressive, but they actually have stayed. In comparison with Dublin, late 1950s, they were doing the numbers that Knock is down. I was looking at the other airports that have similar numbers. Some of them have grown a little bit. Exeter, Inverness, Ronald's Way's grown a little bit bigger. Leitch, Norwich have fallen away, and Coventry is like Galway and Waterford, it's closed. But remember here, the target. Lourdes in 1979, 359,000. Cork in 1983, 324,000. Canon Horan held up the figure. He talked about 2 scheduled flights a week in winter and 5 in summer with a shuttle service, bringing air passengers from Shannon, flight from Shannon to Knock. The main dependence of the airport would be on charter flights. But look at where Lourdes is today, under 400,000. And look at where Cairns were in 1983, 300,000, gone to the millions now. Could that happen with Knock in the right circumstances? Yes, we might look at that. You can see a Thomas Davis song was my inspiration in 2009. What I was making was projections were very, very low with Cairns. Obvious point, outbound makes inbound routes possible. So you don't worry unduly that an inbound airport had turned into an outbound. You can see a Thomas Davis song was my inspiration in 2009. You can see the cast of characters that were dominating media in 2009. One of the points I was making then is that we may be talking ourselves into gloom, and actually Ireland West would be a good place to start if you're talking about revitalisation. There was nothing new about a boom and bust cycle when you're dependent on Ryanair coming in, boosting numbers and then pulling out again. This is one of the slides I reused quite a bit. The tiger takes a bath. We didn't know how big a bath it was going to take. I was talking about supporting our supporters, but some of these supporters were running into rocky territory. Sunworld and John Kinnan no longer involved in the industry. Tony Collins happily still here. Very, very astute reading of how the business works. Barry Walsh now involved with Concord and Joe Walsh Tours. Jim Furlong and his daughter Tanya and Mary Denton have stepped into that company now. Talked about the importance of connectivity, airports within 2 hours, and how in recession airlines would look a little bit differently at connectivity. A huge hub airport was no longer necessarily the future. I left the event in Knock to fly to the launch of a big cruise ship, Oasis of the Seas. It was commissioned during the boom and launched during the recession. But while we were there, we heard about the demise of these guys. Not entirely recession related, because the lack of flexibility by the regulator certainly contributed to their demise, but it sent a huge shock through the travel industry and shook confidence as well. One of the themes was that a recession was a terrible opportunity to waste. We talked about some of the opportunities companies were going to have to renegotiate as money got a little bit tighter. This was going to create opportunities for the travel trade. It was a bit of feel-good stuff. We've talked about the importance of independence advice. It was always going to triumph when money got tight. But the Irish Tour Operators Federation were declining. There was about 20 of them. They declined to a handful nowadays. And dynamic packaging was now becoming the big story for travel agents. Safety and security, all of that was going to be more important. I thought more important than it actually turned out. Advantages to the travel agent included more access to beds and seats, especially as capacity was cut. Ryanair used to make great play how the closing down of rivals created opportunities for them. Most of all, I said, get out of the commodities business. Competing on price in a recession ain't gonna work. And I made the very obvious point about don't be a transaction, be a relationship. Build up those relationships. Which in a way is what Knock Airport was doing. "Don't be afraid" was probably a mantra of Monsignor James Horan. Here he is saying thousands of passengers, thousands of pilgrims, thousands of people would return to Knock Airport to find their lost routes, this big inbound airport that he had a vision for. Some people found it extremely successful businesses during the recession. Here's Paul Hackett. He founded Click and Go, and the Blue Insurance Company started in the middle of the recession, became very successful. Ryanair managed to double their passenger numbers through the recession. At first glance, the stories of Knock's passenger numbers, it's really a big growth between 2002 and 2006 and not much since. But when you consider the recession and the impact on other airports, Knock has done extremely well. It held its numbers. Look at that big boost in 2011 when everybody else was bleeding, 11.1%. Growth in 2012 and 2014 as well, and then another little jump in 2016. Knock held it. Cork peaked 2008, 3.2 million. It slipped. Shannon peaked a little earlier, 2007, 3.6, down to 1.8. While Cork and Shannon declined, Knock held its numbers, and it's going to go to 809,000 in 2019. And you've got to remember, Dublin has grown and grown and grown, and Dublin is now nearly 70% of the traffic to the island. What are the trends for 2020? A few months before I talked here, this woman was singing for Sweden in the Eurovision Song Contest. Who would have thought that her daughter would become one of the most recognisable faces of 2019? And this has been hard in Brussels. As the Ursula von der Leyen Commission moves in, it's a little bit worrying. They barely mention tourism and travel in the briefing documents. As the saying goes, green is the new black, and it's not going to be good for transport. It's certainly not going to be good for aviation. We eventually have a transport commissioner. Ravana Plum didn't make it across the line. We have Adina Iona Valea now. Is she going to be able to protect aviation against regressive taxes? One voice that will be making itself very, very loud is the Airlines for Europe group, led by this man.
And integrating, or at least bringing the peripheral members up to the same level as the central states. These aviation taxes are regressive. They are bad for competition, the competitiveness of European transport. They damage the competitiveness of the peripheral countries, and particularly the islands.
Huge uncertainty remains as to what will happen in aviation and travel after Brexit. Will there be unrestricted access from Britain to the rest of Europe? All the arrangements that are in place are in short term and have a ticking clock. This is the first Aer Lingus A321 LR. Lots of excitement about developments in technology. The LR will open up transatlantic routes which wouldn't have been viable or possible otherwise. The real problem is delays in technology. The 321 is late, and the Boeing 737 MAX is grounded. Regional airports love the idea of this baby, the Sukhoi Superjet. The real problem was spare parts and performance issues meant that it wasn't viable. 100 seats, perfect for regional airports like Knock. Sadly, a non-starter at this stage. Tourism Ireland are coming off a little bit of growth, but look at the figures behind Niall Gibbons last Monday. 0, -1 and 0. They're talking growth because that's what they do. Most of the good news has come from North America, with Britain in decline, but the big disappointment in the last quarterly figures is Germany. Is it going into decline? And this is their big idea. They're going to match regions with major overseas markets, and Mayo is being matched with Germany, partly because of the German routes out of Knock. 20% of the tourist traffic that comes to the Wild Atlantic Way strays north of Galway. The big push of the first phase of the Fill Your Heart with Ireland campaign was the northern half of the Wild Atlantic Way. Best access airport to that region? Knock. Three big challenges then: near certainty of new aviation taxes which will hurt travel. They damaged outbound out of Scandinavia already. Netherlands and Belgium have introduced them. France is on the way, very, very likely. Germany is on the way as well. A decline in Germany has already been flagged in the stats. And we're not going to get closure on the Brexit issue anytime soon. And here lies Canon Horan, safely ensconced under a big slab of granite. His vision of the big inbound airport never worked out, but we've got something far more interesting and far more resilient. They have twice the passenger numbers that Lourdes has in a year, and that could get even bigger despite the challenges. Canon Horan didn't know a lot about aviation, but he knew a hell of a lot about marketing. He was wiser than even the Christy Moore song acknowledged.